coming to this exciting simple lecture. We'll just give everybody a minute to come in. We have a lot of people today, so thanks for joining the session. If you can just mute yourself during the entire sample lecture, that will be great. It is 8:01. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where in the world you're calling in from. My name is Tina. I'm the manager of recruitment admissions for the MBA programs here at the Sauder School of Business, UBC. So if I can ask you to type in the chat box and just the country or the city you're calling in from today, that will be great. So this is a sample lecture with Dr. Murali Chandrashekaran, and we'll start shortly after a few slides today. We would like to acknowledge that UBC Vancouver's Point Grey campus is located on the traditional, ancestral, and ceded territory of the Musqueam people. We would also like to acknowledge that you're joining us today from many places near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. Just to let you know that this is a recording session, and the recording will be used in various marketing pieces by the UBC Sauder School of Business, including print and long line. So if you do not want to be recorded, please turn off your camera. Okay. Just some housekeeping stuff for the Zoom best practices. Again, this will be sample lecture, so we ask you to kindly mute yourself during the entire sample lecture, unless obviously Dr. Murali will have some questions for you or have some conversation with you. But again, if you have any questions, please feel free to type in the chat box or use the raise hand function. Okay, so I would like to introduce Murali here, Dr. Murali Chandrashekaran here today in the room. Hi, Dr. Murali. And so he's a professor, marketing and behavioral science division. And he will be giving you a very exciting simple lecture today. And in the room today, we have a couple colleagues. So other than myself, I have Sophie here. If Sophie, you can just wave your hands. And we also have Lara here, our marketing specialist from the recruitment admissions. Hi, Lara. And we also have Nicole here, who is our senior manager recruitment admissions. So we have a full team here today to answer any question you may have about your applications, about the program today. So please feel free to type in any questions you have in the chat box. Before we get to the sample lecture, just want to mention some important deadlines for the cycle. We have the early bird deadline this year. As some of you may have known, this deadline is September 5th, 2023, so it's about 2 weeks from now. The early bird deadline means that if you get an offer of admissions in the near future, you will get the $1,500 early entrance award. And first application deadline, October 17th, second application deadline, January 9th, and final round for international application is March 12th, 2024. Final deadline for domestic applicants, May 7th, 2024. The official documents, June 30th, 2024, means that you need to provide official transcript and official degree certificate by that deadline. But please also note, if you are submitting your application by the final deadline, you need to submit your supporting documents 2 weeks after, within the 2 weeks after the final deadline. Okay, and some contact information there, MBA inbox, and Sophie and myself's email address there. All right, so without further ado, I will pass the floor to Murali to start the sample lecture.
Thank you, Tina. Can you guys hear me? A little nod if you, okay, excellent, thank you. Okay, well, let me start by first saying that on behalf of the Sauder School of Business, we're pretty excited that all of you are here. This is a big choice you guys are making of where to go to school to get your MBA. You're even considering the Sauder School of Business is a privilege that we take seriously. And I just want to express my gratitude that you're here to engage in this conversation. And that's what this class is going to be. It's not a class in a traditional sense of the word. I am certainly not going to be lecturing for many, many hours. I'm going to be posing a few thoughts for you to consider, and then I'm going to stop and I'm going to ask questions of you. And the way in which I want to conduct this conversation is that we will raise our hands. All of you have used Zoom before, I'm assuming, and you will have access to an electronic hand. And as soon as you raise your electronic hand, I'll be able to see and call on you. And your participation in this class is just as important as anyone else's, right? So I encourage you to jump in and speak, because that's how we have discussions and engage in conversations here at the Sauder School of Business. Okay, so that's the basic ground rule. The basic ground rule is jump in and get engaged and share your thoughts, because each one of us has a valuable point of view, and sharing that point of view is most important respectfully in a conversation. So that's the only ground rule. Okay, so let me just pull up some slides and we'll get this conversation started.
So in the meantime, I know Murali trying to put the presentation up. I just want to answer a quick question in the chat box from, oh, here we go, from the GREG Matt Weaver. I will be sending the link in the chat box. There it goes.
Okay, can you guys see my screen? Okay, great. So as Tina introduced me, my name is Murali Chandrashekaran. I'm a professor here at the Sauder School of Business. And I have been here for almost over a decade now. And I'm originally from Bangalore, India, where I grew up. I got my first degree in electrical engineering at the Indian Institute of Technology in Madras, and then went to the US to get my PhD, lived in many different countries in the world, and we now live here in Vancouver. But what we're going to talk about today is sustainable development goals and cities, right? Broad topics, but really intersperse the discussion of the role of business in each of these. Okay. So one of the things that is a key topic that engages with the idea of sustainability is the institution called the United Nations Global Compact. The UN Global Compact was launched about the turn of in 1999 or so. There was a discussion launched by the then UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who was interested in inspiring businesses to get engaged, to align their strategies, operations along the principles of human rights, labor, environment, anti-corruption, and to take action to advance societal goals. So the idea that businesses would be central to this, and that's what Ban Ki-moon was really keen on inspiring business to do. So 2000 was launched the UN Global Compact. So my question then to you is, in 2000, how many companies around the world joined the UN Global Compact when it was launched? So it's easy. Your response to this, I'm going to look at the chat. All you have to do is type. If you think it's less than 50, type A. If it's 50 to 100, B. If it's 200, type C. And around 1,000, D. And I'm just going to take a quick moment to explore this. Okay. Well, in general, I'm seeing basically more A's and B's. I see a few of you typing in C's. The right answer is 44. 44 companies joined the UN Global Compact in the year 2000. Well, needless to say, Ban Ki-moon was not excited. He thought, how is it possible that of all the businesses in the world, only 44 care about these principles? Well, that was 2000. Fast forward, and now we're in 2023. As of January of this year, how many companies are now signatories of the UN Global Compact? Well, again, look at the chat, and if you can punch in your responses, that'd be great. Okay. Well, I'm beginning to see a lot of people moving away from A's and B's towards C's and D's. And this obviously illustrates the power of the group. And basically, the right answer is D. I think there are about 12,800 companies that are signatories to the UN Global Compact. And why is this important? Why is this important? It is important because the focus of business has slowly shifted in the last 2 decades to include something that is fundamental to our ideas of what it means to care for one another and for humanity. And for those of you who are interested in digging into this, there is a neat document that you can pull up on the idea of how to make global goals for local business, the idea of what is the multi-year strategy for the UN Global Compact to drive business awareness and action to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by the year 2030, which raises the question, what is the Sustainable Development Goals? And the Sustainable Development Goals, consequent to the launch of the UN Global Compact, was a multi-nation agreement to focus on several goals for the planet, and the target date was set as 2030, that by the year 2030, we will achieve these goals as a collective of nations. The Sustainable Development Goals follows what was the Millennial Development Goals, or the MDGs, that had a target date of 2015. By 2015, those slowly morphed into the Sustainable Development Goals, and you have 17 different goals that have been articulated, starting with seeing no poverty, onto zero hunger in the world, good health and well-being, and on and on. You can see all these different goals. For instance, Sustainable Goal 11 speaks about sustainable cities and communities, the idea of resilience, the idea of how, in an increasingly urbanized world, what does sustainability look like? And then ending with Sustainable Goal 17, which is partnerships for the goals. In this little conversation, we're going to touch on a couple of these, but this is the backdrop with which we are going to work. Now, this is one way to view the Sustainable Development Goals, and it illustrates all of these goals. But there are multiple ways in which you can view the Sustainable Development Goals, and one interesting framework that the Stockholm Resilience Center has presented is what they call a donut model, where they've grouped different elements of these 17 SDGs in the graphic that you see in front of you, and grouped it into 3 broad buckets. The first are the goals relating to the biosphere, right? What does the planet and nature and planetary considerations, where do they fall in? And that's the biosphere dimension. So you see these 4 different goals, SDG 6, 13, 14, and 15, falling into the biosphere bucket. And then the Stockholm Resilience Center also articulates that another dimension which is called, which they label society, deals with the aggregation of human beings, and sustainable goal 11, cities, for instance, falls into the society bucket. And then the last one that they present for our consideration is the ideas of goals related to the economy. That at the fundamental level, there's a biosphere, then there's society and economy, and SDG 17s then sits as the icing on this little donut cake. So that's another way in which we can think about what SDGs look like. So my question, just to have a very quick discussion, I'm going to stop sharing so that I can now enable us to see one another, is what do you think of poverty? What is poverty in your mind? Okay. Now, for those who want to jump in on this question, let's see your hands. Let's give a minute for people to find their electronic hands, and we can jump in. Okay. Kevin, do you want to unmute, Kevin, and share with us what your thoughts are on
Sure.
poverty?
Hi, Professor, and hi, rest of the class. When I think of poverty, obviously the nutshell version that comes to mind is just the inability to access or acquire necessities for life. So if I think of like Maslow's hierarchy, I think food, water, shelter, basics.
Okay, so your idea is that people who don't have access to the basics, water, food, shelter, etc. Okay? Okay. Please forgive me if I don't pronounce your name right. Let's see, we have, is it Kalal?
It's Tolisile. It's a difficult name. It's a click.
Thank you. Thank you, Kolisile. You have a click in your name. I love it. I love it. Okay.
Thank
Please.
you. Just to add what Kevin said, it's living on less than $1 per day. Well, generally.
Okay. Okay. Living on less than $1. And that's what the UN, for instance, embraces as its definition of poverty. And when countries say we have eliminated poverty, it means that they have raised the minimum wage above that basic level. And that follows from the definition of how you've talked about it. Okay, let's take one more. Fazel?
Hi, Murali. I wanted to add what Kevin said, that it's not that they don't have access, it's that they don't have the enough monetary funds or money to get those access. I think that's what poverty is. Not having enough money to get those essential access.
Okay. Okay, so these are all interesting views, and let's hold on this thought, and we'll come back to this topic later, but thank you for sharing. Okay, so let's get back to the discussion at hand and see where we can go with this. Okay, now each time I do this, I have to make sure that you can see my screen. Can you see my screen now, please? So my next question very quickly is, we saw these three different buckets that the Stockholm Resilience Center talks about: biosphere, economy, and society. Which do you think, and you can type this in your chat and then I'll call on one or two of you, which do you think is the most important to start with? Should, as a collective of people and nations, should we start with society? Should we start with economy? Or should we start with the biosphere? Okay, let's go to Helena. Helena says we got to biosphere is the foundation of everything. But then Helena also says, oh, by the way, that's the foundation, but we also have to do everything. Helena, what do you think, Helena? Take a moment and share your thoughts with us, please.
Hello, good morning. Well, I think they're all three important, right? Like we cannot have functional business in if any of them is not functional. At the same time, I feel like biosphere deserves higher consideration in terms of how we balance it and how we neglected it to this point. Yeah.
And why do you think we've neglected it, Helena?
I think we just weren't aware of some of the impacts we have on our environment, on the biosphere itself. So we are just seeing the consequences now, while the society has, pretty arguably at different parts of the world, the society still has some kind of voice to let us know if something is imbalanced. The same for economy, like we have key metrics indicators that we can refer to. But when it comes to the biosphere, I feel like we actually still don't fully understand the complexity of it.
Perhaps they don't understand the complexity. And that could be a possible response. But I would urge you to think more about that. Why, not just you, Helena, but everybody else, why do you think it hasn't happened? So let's take Ella. Ella, you also said the biosphere. Why do you think, though, from Helena's perspective, she says we haven't yet paid attention to it? Instead, what do you think we are paying attention to, Ella?
I think that we need to start with here simply because that's the genesis of everything. The genesis of mankind.
I understand, Ella. My question, though, was slightly different. My question was, why do you think we haven't paid attention? If what Helena's saying is correct, why do you think we haven't paid attention? What are we paying attention to instead?
We are paying attention more to the benefits at the expense of trying to return back to the environment. For instance, when you look at trees, we get a lot of products from trees, such as paper. We'd cut so many trees to get this paper, but we forget that we need to plant more to be able to get the benefits of paper. So I tend to think that we've forgotten to do that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And I agree with you. There are many benefits, but the question is, what have we been paying attention to? And that's something that I urge you to think more about, and think about, what are we doing instead as a species? What are we doing instead as a species? And we'll try to get to that in a few minutes. There's a real nice article in the McKinsey Global Institute, published recently, about a year ago now, where the world's largest companies stand on nature, on the biosphere. What are they doing? And it's a real neat perspective. And what they do is they've surveyed global Fortune 500 companies on different dimensions of nature: climate change, freshwater consumption, chemical plastic pollution, forest and seabed loss, biodiversity loss, and nutrient pollution. And what they have uncovered in their survey is that for the most part, Fortune Global 500 companies acknowledge and have set a target for climate change for themselves. But when you think about the vast majority of the dimensions of what can be called nature, it is either no acknowledgement or target set. And if targets have been set, the question of whether the time frame is something that companies are working towards becomes an issue. The question is, where do the companies that you're working for, where do they fall in this, right? And if nature is that important and it's a foundation of everything, what would we like to see these data look like? And why then are we not seeing this? It's an empirical question for you to think about. And if we had a lot more time, we will come up with some potential responses, right? So on the one hand, you have the dynamics of nature. And on the other hand, when we think about the flows of humanity over the centuries, there's another real interesting article in a book, actually, by McKinsey Global Institute. This is about almost a decade old now. And they talk about the forces that are rewriting the world's economic operating system. And very quickly, what are these forces? Well, one force that they analyze at depth is the idea of global connections. It's perhaps a little bit trite to say, well, we live in an increasingly interconnected world. And there's a lot of data that you can connect in terms of the volume of trade, finance, people, data, and how there is an interconnection across these, leading over time to much greater volatility in a more connected world, because what happens in one part of the world impacts what's happening in another part of the world in very direct and very concrete ways. All right, so the first force that they talk about is greater global connections. The second are shifts in demography. Right? In many different countries, the population is aging and the workforce is graying. The average age of citizens in Japan now is about 47. In China, it's about 37. And in India, it's about 26. And for the next couple of years, it's going to get younger. So for the longest time, if you went to India, they would say, we just have too many mouths to feed. And now in India, there's a concept of the demographic dividend that is spoken of. The idea that India has a young workforce and that having productive workforce will lead to greater economic prosperity. So the idea of demographic trends is a second force that is shaping the planet. The third is technological change, right? The idea that we are fast and rapidly, while there's globalization happening, there is an interconnectedness technologically through either IoT, artificial intelligence, and there are disruptive technologies that shape the economic structure. Farmers in remote villages in Africa or India have access now to the spot prices of commodities on trade exchanges because they have access to the internet and have a mobile phone. It changes the supply chain of information and the flows of money as well. And by many observers, that this is going to increase prosperity among people who didn't have access to technology beforehand. But the force that I really want to spend a few minutes on in this discussion is the force that they call the disruptive force number one, and that is we live, they claim, in the age of urbanization, right? That countries are becoming much more urbanized, that people are moving from rural settings to urban settings, right? And we have people here from all over the world, and it's not difficult for you to perhaps imagine how relevant this is in the city or country where you're from, right? In emerging markets, right, you see far greater transition into urban settings. And at the same time as this is happening, emerging economies are becoming major forces in the global economic play with the growth of the urban consumer class as well. So the dynamics has shifted in the last 100 years in terms of where people live, play, and the city as a construct becomes really important, especially when you think about the fact that 440 cities in emerging markets will account for nearly half of the global GDP by 2025, right? 5 billion people live in cities. And by the year 2030 or 2050, 70% of us will be living in cities. 600 cities globally will generate about 65% of the global economic growth by 2025, but at the same time will also generate 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. 600 cities in the world. 400 largest cities in the world account for 2% of the world's surface, but account for 75% of the world's energy consumption. And as we speak today, and as we meet today, more than 1 billion people live in informal settlements without access to basic services, right? Informal settlements, in other places, in other words, slums, urban slums, deeply vulnerable communities. This is our planet. And here's a graphic on the right corner. Each of those little lines is the population. Cities accounting for massive, massive population dynamics and all of the dynamics that you see here. Now, at the Sauder School of Business, this is a topic that is of real interest to us, and we've launched a few years ago this collaborative called the Collaborative for Urban Resilience and Effectiveness. And it brings together universities, colleges, corporates, cities, and communities to engage in research, pedagogy, capacity building, and knowledge exchange in this topic of cities. And on the left-hand side of your screen, you see all of the different universities and institutions that are part of it. And one of the more interesting partnerships that we've now launched is the one called SDI, where the Shack and Slum Dwellers International that does work in informal settlements in Africa, South America, and in cities in Asia as well. So we've learned a few things in the last few years, which I'd like to share, which raises then the question, what do we mean by urban resilience? Which leads us to the next question, which I'll come to in a second, and that is, what is the role of business in that? So urban resilience, we can think of as a capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, etc., to survive, adapt, and grow no matter what kinds of stresses or shocks they experience. For a long time, we used to think about urban resilience from the acute shock perspective. Earthquakes, seismic events, tsunamis, etc. But we're beginning to realize as well that everyday factors, chronic stresses, have a powerful role in shaping the dynamics in cities. High unemployment, inefficient public transportation systems, endemic violence, chronic water and food shortages. For those of you who are from Cape Town or Chennai in India, you will begin to understand the impact of chronic water shortages and how that threatens the resilience in cities as well. So against that background, students within our MBA program work on projects in classes on cities that we offer. And we've done projects. We've taken students to work on projects, for instance, in Chennai, in India, on rooftop gardens and urban farming, and the use of water in informal communities. We've worked on projects in Juarez, Mexico, for instance, or in Vancouver, Canada, and on and on. But the idea of an MBA student working on strategy projects for cities where humanity is and the challenges that we've been talking about is what makes an MBA program in general interesting. And these are not just UBC MBA students. but we're part of a network called the Global Network for Advanced Management, where we have students from 30 or so different schools across the globe working together on projects. So when I teach a class on cities, I have, let's say, 45 students. They come from 18 time zones. And each of our students from sitting here in Vancouver will work on projects with students from Cape Town or Tokyo or Bangalore or from London or from Sydney, Australia. And so the idea of global collaboration is what this sort of an approach leads to in cities as well. I can answer questions if you have any later, but these are examples of projects that we've done. Now, what I'd like to do is quickly pose against this background a question from my hometown. I grew up, as I said, in Bangalore, and I left India to go get my PhD in the US. And when I left India, India was called, and is still called, the Garden City of India. It was gardens and parks everywhere, right? And the population was 5.6 million, right? 10 years later, it was 8.7 million. And 11 years later, late last year, it was 13.2 million people in the city of Bangalore. And here's a picture from traffic. And this is not unique to Bangalore. You go to Sao Paulo, you'll see this. You go to Jakarta, Indonesia, you'll see this. You go to Lagos in Nigeria, you'll see something like this, right? But what we are doing is also partnering with institutions in other countries, and the Smart Cities mission in India, which has 100 cities that they're working with, have appointed in every different city a director to focus on resilience issues, right? So the director for the Center for Smart Cities in India, in Bangalore, when I asked him, what is the vision for Bangalore? The idea was to make Bangalore India's most livable city. And so I said, okay, so what are the dimensions that you are interested in? What does that mean, livable city? And he said, here are the dimensions on my mind. I'm interested in mobility, transportation, congestion. I'm interested in water and sanitation. I care about the environment, underprivileged and the poor. I want to deal with poverty. I also want to deal with health, education, and housing, right? And you say, well, these are all important issues. These are all important issues. Okay, so my question to you, and I'll stop sharing. My question to you is, what's the next step? What would you, with your background, and all of you are now preparing to go get an MBA, you all come from different backgrounds. What is the next step that the director for the Smart Cities mission, what should he do? What's the next step? Again, take a moment and raise your hand, and we'll get to your thoughts. Okay, Shaurya.
Hi, Dr. Murali. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. So my suggestion on the question that you asked for the director would be something that I see Bangalore has done, and that would be decentralizing the resources in the SEZs. Now, if all of the things are in the heart of the city because it has the accessibility, it's very hard to take things out of the city and decentralize the issues that are coming in. So if all the companies lie in the heart of the city, all the opportunities lie in the heart of the city, people will definitely cluster around that, and the utilization of resources will get extremely stretched over the limit. So setting up the suburbs in a way that bringing those facilities to the suburb will help decentralize and migrate a part of the population to those areas, and hence improve the planning of the city. So essentially extend the boundary of the city and decentralize the opportunities.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Shaurya. And this is an important issue in many cities. The question for cities is, do you grow up, become taller? Hong Kong, do you go up or do you go out, expand the borders? And Shaurya is saying, you got to send people out. Mexico City did that. Mexico City years ago said, we have an affordable housing problem. People were living in the center of the city in really difficult contexts, informal settlements. So the city built affordable housing in the outskirts of the city and said, here's inexpensive housing. So they had people move. Then what happened? People who were living on the outskirts realized, wait a second, we work though, our jobs are in the center of the city. So they had to find transportation to head down into the center of the city, and they soon found out that they were paying more for transportation than they were saving on rent. So you want to guess what they did? They moved back to the center of the city, right? It's not a bad answer, Shaurya, right? But for every action that you take, remember that there is a potential for an unintended consequence as well, right? And that really makes strategy in cities very, very complex. Okay, but thank you, Shaurya, for your thought. Okay, let's take one more. Okay, Rifat.
Hi, Dr. Murali. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So in this scenario, what I would suggest is you're absolutely right in saying that there's an equal and opposite, let's say, reaction in terms of when you take a decision. I think one thing that needs to be done here is looking at each and every macroeconomic factors and trying to prioritize which are the items that the director would target first, and then move on to which should be next in the list. So in your example of Mexico City, they should have targeted mobility first, because that's the economic circumstances of Mexico. The director can take a look at the economic circumstance and also socioeconomic circumstance of Chennai, then try to figure out whether it's housing, whether it's the core issue, is it mobility, or is it sanitation, or is it water treatment facilities. And based on that understanding, there should be a prioritization of which should be targeted first. And then that can be broken down into phases, and then we move on in each particular order of decreasing priorities. That's basically how I would recommend that the director approach the scenario.
I love it. Rifat, I'm going to say congratulations to you. You are already thinking like an MBA student.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And then if you were in my class, I would then say to you, okay, but can the director do all this on his own?
No, he probably needs a team of MBA graduates to do that strategization for him.
Team of MBA graduates. Okay. Well, let's take one more. And I see some really interesting questions, interesting comments. And Lee.
I come from an urban planning background, and Mexico City's big problem is geography. Mexico City was built on a lagoon island, and so geographically speaking, the city is sinking. They have an urban sprawl issue, and one strategy me and my business partners have been developing is to expand the rural areas. The geography of Mexico is mostly mountainous, and so their urban populations are built along the US borders in the south. And I have traveled through Mexico before, and I believe the solution to urban problems is to encourage urban migration to rural areas and develop rural areas as a whole. Scarcity. That's the number one economic problem. There's not enough resources to support the population. But the challenge is, how do we encourage people to move to the rural areas? And that's a question I've been working on.
Thank you. Thank you, Anli. I'm going to take one more comment, and I'm hoping that Miss Stevenson, please pronounce your first name for me so that I can.
Nena, thank you. Yeah.
Nena. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nena. What should the director in Bangalore do?
So I remember the question you asked when you said, how will the director be able to do all of that? Whose help would he need? I had a different opinion. I mean, obviously the MBA graduate, yeah, but I feel like working with employers could also promote and can make things easier. So one of the things that happened in UK, especially during COVID, is because lots of companies wanted to do the whole sustainability thing, they wanted to be able to meet their goals. They encourage workers to work from home. Even till now, most companies actually tell their staff to just stay at home and not come into the workplace. That really helped because it reduced the amount of carbon emissions, so people drove less to work. And then it also pushed people to living in the outskirts. So now people made the choice to live away from the cities because it was a lot cheaper to find housing there. And then also the fact that they're working remotely means they have almost no reason to remain in the city. That would have said, for me, I feel like that probably is the first thing I would expect the director to do. So maybe give tax breaks to companies that would encourage this. For companies that can do it, then it means that you have a less amount of people coming into the cities to work. And then for the ones coming in, we can then talk about mobility. Because if you have, I'm not sure if there's a picture about when you have one bus taking people, bringing people into work, and then translating into probably 20 cars. When you sort of set up proper mobility, you'd have maybe trains, electric trains, on whatever other mass means of transportation. That reduces the amount of emissions as well that's being released. You could also make it electronic as well, which means there's almost no emission. So you can then start tackling things like that downwards.
Yeah.
That was just my contribution.
Thank you, Nana. But the point that I want you to take away from this is, the director in Bangalore wants to address so many different things.
Yeah.
Right? And they're all important, right?
Yeah.
If you're a citizen in Bangalore, you want mobility to be addressed, but you also want access to housing and education. You also want to breathe fresh air, right? And the issue in cities, there's always a good next step, right? So if you decide to apply to the SODA MBA program, and we are fortunate enough for you to say, yep, I'm going to join you guys, then on the very first week, when you take the core marketing class, when I ask you the same question, what's the next step? I'm hoping that you will say, you got to go and talk to other people and bring people together. Okay. Because you can never do things on your own. Cities, my friends, are systems of systems. They're not just a system. They are systems of systems, right? It is easier to be a physicist because you can work in a lab where you control everything. Right? So when people say, oh, I'm not as smart as a nuclear scientist, let me tell you, it is easier to be a nuclear scientist than to be an urban planner. You can control temperature, you can control pressure, you can control everything in a lab, and you can bring nuclear particles together, create fusion, create fission. You can do all sorts of amazing things because we have the ability to control things in a lab. But when you unleash reality in a context called the city, it gets very complex, right? You can't control much, and partnerships become important. So somewhere between SDG 1, poverty, and SDG 17, partnerships for impact, is the answer, right? So why is partnerships so hard? Why is it so hard to form partnerships? And I want to leave you with a little bit of thinking for yourself, right? I want you to think about this, and then we can wrap it up and see if you guys have any questions that I will endeavor to answer, right? So my question is to address this last little question that I want you to think about is, why are astronauts lucky, right? And today I sit back as an incredibly proud citizen of India. We just happen to be the first country to land a spacecraft on the South Pole of the moon, right? With every other challenge that is prevalent. People are fired up because we've done that. So why are astronauts lucky? Well, astronauts are lucky, in my view, because they get to see this, right? They get to see this. This is the Earth, a picture of the Earth taken on July 16th, 1969 by Apollo 11 as they were headed towards the moon. And this is a picture of Earth from the surface of the moon, referred to now commonly as the blue marble, that there is the Earth sitting in the void, in the darkness, right? And there is our planet. And every astronaut who has gone up to either the International Space Station or up into space and seen this view experiences what is called the overview effect. And the overview effect that I will leave you to think about is that when they see Earth from afar, they describe a cognitive shift in awareness, right? And the idea that when you're flung so far away from Earth, you become totally overwhelmed and awed by the fragility and unity of life on our planet. And here's the story of Ron Garan, who is who spent time astronaut traveling into the space station. And here's a picture of him engaging in a maneuver outside the space station, right? And he's holding on to this little device that will create an arc so that he's doing some tests out there. And he says, as I approached the top of this arc, it was as if time stood still. And I was flooded with both emotion and awareness. But as I looked down at Earth, the stunning, fragile oasis, right? This island that's been given to us, he says, a sadness came over me and I was hit in the gut with an undeniable and sobering contradiction. And what is that contradiction that he was talking about? And there was a fundamental contribution that everybody who goes up so far away from the Earth uses one word to describe what happens on Earth. And that word is us. And they talk about the fact that there is only us, right? But that's from space. And then you ask the question, what about for the majority of us on Earth? How do we see interactions with other human beings, right? And which brings me to the last point that I want to leave you with, which is the great modern divide, us versus them, right? Us versus them. This is a researcher by the name of Robert Sapolsky. Robert Sapolsky is a biologist and a neuroscientist at Stanford. And he was interested in a simple experiment where he asked people, he put people in front of a computer screen, and he flashed faces on the computer screen. And the instructions were very simple for the experiment. And he wired people to measure brain activity, right? And he said, when you see this face, you press this button if you think of the word us, and you press another button if you think of the word them. So it's us or them. Very simple. So he flashed faces at people. And he found something really interesting, that when people pressed the them button, when you saw a face and you said that that person belongs to a different group called them, something really interesting happened in the human brain. And he found that the part of the brain that was activated was called the insula. Deep in the recess of the brain, it's an almond-shaped structure, right? Almond-shaped structure. And what he found was that it took 200 milliseconds for that to get fired up. Now, why is it important? Why is this idea of the insula important in this experiment? Because Sapolsky would tell us that the same part of the brain, the insula, was responsible for our ancestors when they were running around the forests, foraging for food, when they came upon a putrid fruit. Something in the brain said to them, don't eat that, by evoking a feeling of disgust. So the insula protected us biologically so that we could evolve as a species to today. The insula was responsible for feelings of disgust. And Sapolsky finds that it's the same part of the brain that is activated when we think of someone as a them and not as an us. So if you think about why is it hard to form partnerships, and think about how hard it is for us to overcome this fundamental, deep-wired, modern divide in our own brains, Sapolsky would say, it's really, really hard. So I'll close with that, leave that as food for thought for you, and have you think about how we as a species can make progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals without forming good partnerships, SDG 17, and how we can form good partnerships, and what does that mean, and how do we do that? And that is worthy of thought. And I hope wherever you go for your MBA, that you continue to think about this question, because it is going to need all of us to think about it in order for any one of us to benefit from the thought from all of us. I'll stop there. Tina, I don't know if we have a few minutes for Q&A, but I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes, and I'll leave it at that. But I want to thank you for your participation, and thank you again for just being here.
Thanks so much, Murali. I certainly will enjoy more of the sample lectures if it's continue going, but I know that time is limited today. So I hope that you get to learn a lot from Murali today. We will stay, as Murali mentioned, that he can stay for, maybe we'll give 3 more minutes until 9:05. You have additional questions, we can take 1 or 2.